Welcome to the module on the state in the area of conflict. Thereby, we actually begin with the discussion of the conflict theory and by the terminology of the word conflict in the arena of capitalism. Conflict is basically a relationship between two or more individuals who they have to think or decide on themselves, but they have incompatible goals. So these goals can have conflicting thoughts or interest, which may be real or perceived, and which may be kind of an exertion over material resources, some kind of ownership rights, which one group acquires and the other group does not. So thereby conflict is basically perceived as a negative term with negative connotations on it. But basically the conflict is neither negative or positive. The aspects have to be readdressed in this manner. So in this particular context, the conflict dimensions can be explored. In terms of the dimensions of the conflict, we mean that the conflict has positive aspects when it directs attention to the injustices that need to be addressed. Because conflict is an eye-opener for a society to point out the degrees of deprivation, the degrees of disparity or discrimination which the working class actually experience over a period of time. So this requires readdressal in terms of policies and different state interventions. So it promotes a much needed change, a revolutionary policy, or any kind of proactiveness through organizations and systems so that some kind of problem solving can take place. So the need for any kind of revolution or ushering for any change is deeply rooted within the positive dimensions of the conflict, which becomes an eye-opener for a society. However, the negative aspects are said as destructive behavior because it can lead to loss of life and property resulting from the violence or the pain or trauma that is the result of the violence. So this destruction is actually making the society to become traumatized or the society to go for a deconstruction. So this is one of the negative aspects of the word conflict. So interstate war is a violent conflict that comes up whenever the war comes in between the states and where it reaches the level of solidarity in terms of military intervention and some kind of fatalities. So for some interstate conflict datasets, the threshold of war is 1,000 or more fatalities. So this is basically threatened or actually violent conflict takes place, and that is how conflict becomes a bigger shape. So in a way, the positive dimensions refer to mainly the addressal of the policies, and the negative dimensions refer to the fatalities which occur because of the destructions. So it is said that what can be the causes of the different forms of the conflict and where the state can intervene. The firstly, we actually propose on the war conflict and identify the causes for them. First and foremost, the power and will are the both attributes of the states that include various aspects such as economics, military, international relations, and trade. So in all these dynamics of the economic parameters, which is a macro paradigm, where we say the economics, which is stated by the rule of the law or any kind of market-oriented framework, which may lead to the conflict. Military international relations may deteriorate over time, and any kind of trade restrictions also may play an important role. So power acquisition can also help in economic, military allies, technological allies where the state can project. So this is actually a power struggle or the power acquisition that takes place. Domestic and foreign policy also refer to any sort of conflict where one country may be dominating over the other in terms of government interventions or in terms of limitations of the other country to impede out of its territory. So any number of political situations might cause a war either from the domestic or from the foreign position, and thereby the conflict can be a never-ending process. Moreover, it is said that how the countries can conflict interstate. That means this is basically coming to the question of how the countries can actually resolve them and how they come up together or they can actually diverge from their interest. So in this particular response, the state or the governments play an important role. The first very important word that comes in that government can be more inclusive. This word inclusive has been taken up from the Millennium Development Goals of the year 2000, where it says that engaging a larger segment of the population in any sphere of the globe. So it can be through free and fair elections. That is, the right for the democracy or any kind of democratic framework is very much needed. Reforms can be instituted in a proper manner, that is, designing of reforms so as to address the drivers of the conflict, so that the drivers of the conflict can be mitigated from the very beginning, pursue diplomacy, and offer economic incentives to opposition groups. This is also very much important for encouraging them, at the same time also to look into their concerns. So this is basically a balancing act that the government can take up. Secondly, the foreign countries can also use sanctions to incentivize one or both parties in interested conflicts to come to a negotiating table or implement reforms. This is basically required because whenever the foreign countries come up, they actually come up with any kind of incentives in terms of infrastructure benefits, in terms of special economic zones, or any kind of modes of foreign capital so that the negotiation can take place in a better way. So this can come up in any agricultural commodity, in any allied commodity sectors where both the countries can benefit from a mutual form of exchange. United Nations can build and deploy multinational military force that is actually taken up at the security base for personnel called peacekeepers supplied by the member countries. So these peacekeepers come under the peacemaking principle of the state intervention. United Nations can also appoint these peacekeepers to conflict the zones, but particularly to protect vulnerable people and enforce ceasefires, safeguard elections, and among the other missions. This is one of the interstate activity that can come up where the interstate war can be mitigated. Moreover, it is said that most of the times countries have limited ability to respond because of sovereignty, because of some of the treaties and some of the act that they have signed in order to control what happens in the borders. Some restrictions are there. So some experts argue that a rethink of traditional understandings of sovereignty is required. So any conservative approach can be dropped, and as it required, some kind of actions may be taken so that the global consequences can be mitigated. When the countries fail to protect their citizens or do not meet their obligations to control infectious diseases or prevent terrorism, these countries forfeit their right to sovereignty and foreign countries should intervene. So it is said that any kind of infectious diseases also prevent any kind of foreign litigations, and thereby the conflict can also originate, and state can take an proactive role to mitigate some kind of pandemic or epidemics that can take place. And thereby the control of such kind of activities can also be instrumental to mitigate interstate conflict. So this boils down to the most important principle which the state can intervene is the peacemaking principle. So by the peacemaking principle, it basically refers to the balancing of the powers. Because it is said that the origin of the conflict theory is deep-rooted in the power struggle, where one group has excessive power and the other group is absolutely powerless. And because of this power struggle, conflict takes a bigger shape and thereby creates some destructive effects. So first point that comes up as a slogan under the peacemaking principle is this: you can make peace by balancing powers. That is, conflict over the status quo is a breakdown of what people and groups want, can and will do. So basically we have to understand what people can do, and then only the appropriate actions can be taken, and that is how the balancing power says. So to make peace, it's to achieve a balance of the powers by taking care of the mutual interest, capabilities and wills. This also takes care of the strategies under inclusive growth, because as it is said, state can take an inclusive approach which is rest on the four principles, that is security, that is access, that is opportunity and capabilities. So capabilities must be instilled through skills, and thereby the opportunities can be provided, and thereby the access of our asset can take up, and thereby the equitable distribution can be the inevitable outcome. So in order to facilitate or accelerate the process, there must be balancing of the elements or the conditions which are influencing them. These conditions are none other than the major pillars of inclusive growth, which rest on opportunities and the willpower to make it happen. Moreover, the second important dimension or the proposition of the peacemaking principle is to clarify the conflict situation. This is very much important, the origin to be understood. The epicenter is to be identified in a proper manner. That is, conflict is a dispute defined by the parties, underlying goals and beliefs, mutual perception, communication, and the facts involved. So basically, it is a kind of a lack of coordination among the different groups, maybe lack of cohesiveness, lack of convergence, which makes the word the conflict to come up. But how itself a process of communication and engagement of the fields of expression. That means any kind of communicative channel, any kind of expressiveness, any kind of dialogue between the two can mitigate the arena of the conflict, which the peacemaking principle wants to emphasize. So dialogue is necessary between these two groups who are basically deep-rooted in the conflict theory. So in the process of achieving a new structure of expectations, conflict should integrate goals and mutual perceptions, and thereby a kind of a dialogue is needed so that a resolution can be made and then the parties can understand. So a common resolution, a consensus must come up, which can be done only to clarify the origin of the conflict. Moreover, the balancing process can be shortened. The intensity of the conflict can be reduced, because it is said that the intensity, if it is large, then the entire society needs a retransformation. The antagonism can be lessened because it is actually deep-rooted in the alienation or the mode of deprivation, and the resulting expectations may be more realistic by clarifying the conflicting situation. Because the expectations about the future, where in the future the common consensus can go in, whereby the conflict can come to an end. So basically, under peacemaking principle, clarifying the situation needs to be comprehended. Moreover, the third item under the peacemaking principle is to display commitment. That means attention to how the other perceive one will is essential to peacemaking. That is, giving attention to each other, listening to each other, and also coming up as a common policy. Whether he believes one promises or threats questions one legitimacy or accepts one's capability will help determine if he escalates or settles the conflict. This is very crucial, because whether the promises that has been made by the one group in a positive sense, or the threat which is coming in a destructive sense, whether they are rational or legitimate, and whether there is a capability of an individual or a group to understand, to comprehend, then only the conflict can be settled. That means each one of the groups should be given the freedom to express their voice, to express their statements or the promises. They have to be actually delivered in a rational, in a legitimate manner, and then only a common resolution can be passed with the intervention of the state, and thereby the balancing of powers can be done. So these are the steps which must be followed rigorously under a peacemaking principle. And any kind of unnecessary escalation in terms of getting the situation more and more worse, aggravating the situation, misunderstandings, strive for credibility on basis of demand, request, offer should be believable. That means any kind of unnecessary escalation to be avoided, and thereby some kind of a common consensus can be built out from the peacemaking principle. Moreover, it is said that whenever we go for a peacemaking principle, either the communication is one of the way out, or another way out is creating a distance, which is becoming a gap between the each groups. That is, creating a distance in space from other party and distance in time from a conflict can calm emotions, facilitate a more rational perspective on the issues. This goes back to the strategic play, because any action taken up by a group can invite a counter reaction. The counter reaction can be the instant move, or it may be a silent move. That means if the other group or the opponent remains silent for a certain period of time, it can be considered to be a strategy, but it can also try to alleviate or mitigate the conflict in the short run. So this can be done by temporary withdrawal from the conflict. This can be done from a mutual interest where temporary withdrawal is being done. So collective, social or political conflict and violence and withdrawal can concede moral and physical ground to other side and seriously endanger others' interest. That means any kind of withdrawal policy can also be one of the propositions of peacemaking principle where the distance can be shortened or the creating of distance can come up depending on the situations. So either we go for a dialogue or a communication or we go for getting ourselves withdrawal in order to make the resolution or the consensus to come up. After the propositions of the peacemaking principle, the state can actually prescribe some of the issues which are related to the peace. The first issue that comes in depends on keeping expectations and the power aligned. Expectations about a common resolution that can be made with an optimistic sense and the power aligned in terms of balancing of powers without hurting one group at the cost of other. Peacemaking also requires beginning with things as they are not in some past situation and some future hope. That means any kind of future hope can be highly encouraging for both the groups to survive together in a very convenient experience or in a convenient environment. Peace is the structure of expectations, a social contract which is pointed out by Marx. Because it will be kept only as the parties, for whatever reason, find it all with their intersecting interest, capabilities, wills and do so. So the most important thing is that the groups must understand that they are not surviving in any disjoint sets. The sets have an intersection and given the area of intersection, they must try to satisfy their mutual interest or go for a global convergence. Then only the conflict can come to an end and can be mitigated. Moreover, we can say in terms of the issues related to peacemaking is to address or rather to readdress the balance of powers by making the compensating changes in what one wants and can and will do. Sometimes the government intervenes by providing some kind of subsidy or transfers to those who are deprived. This is basically a compensatory action taken up by the government in order to make them feel that they are not exploited or deprived given the power struggle of the capitalist. So one can also negotiate incremental changes. The treaties and the contracts may be redrawn, understandings may be redefined, and practices can be altered. So thereby this calls for a very important terminology in the arena of conflict theory, that is diplomacy, which means diplomacy can be defined as an art of avoiding war by keeping international expectations in tune with the changing balance of powers among the states. So this diplomatic move is one of the matured move where the state can go for in the long run, where the war conflict can be avoided, international expectations about future consensus, future convergence in their policy making, and to go for a collaborative effort can be done, and thereby the balancing of powers can be addressed. This is very much pronounced in any regional groups that the countries belong to, either the SAARC nations or the NAFTA or BRICS or any kind of G7 economies where all these balancing powers are being done by the diplomatic move of the member countries. So moreover, we have to understand that the countries have the limited ability to respond to the conflicts, and so the countries have to think on their authoritative control. So according to this line of thinking, when countries fail to protect their citizens, this comes when the security part fails or there is a failure of the governance or do not meet their obligations to other countries. That means the other countries are basically in need in terms of any kind of aid or support in any kind of natural calamities or infectious diseases or prevent terrorism. Their right to sovereignty and foreign countries should intervene. So this is the point where the peacemaking can come up, where foreign country can basically lend their hands to basically mitigate these issues. So this is how the peacemaking takes a clear shape. So thereby we can see that what is the role of the capitalist to address the conflict within the state arena. Because here also we have to understand the role of the capitalist whenever the state role is emphasized. Because these two actually go in an opposite direction, where capitalists mainly refer to the private enterprises and state role is where the proactiveness comes in. So as it is said that capitalists always have the interest in choosing the level of monitoring, maximizing their work intensity, also spending the surplus on the luxury consumption, and also going for the lowest cost techniques. So in all these type of areas or in all these type of domains, it is very much important that where the state can intervene and mitigate in terms of various policies. Moreover, we can say that capitalists do not minimize the wage. Capitalists basically go for replacing the workers and they want the things to be done, creating a conflict to evolve from a profit maximizing goal. So capitalists do not minimize wage or maximize work, relocate to distant shores, and they do these things because to fail them to do so and they go out of the business. Moreover, the capitalists also try to resolve or they do not take any initiative to do in that way any operational and strategic conflicts, because the more conflicting arena would be, the more better would be to exercise their control over the larger economic surpluses. So thereby the intervention of the state comes in the purview of conflict, whereby state should exercise some power in order to do so. So this thereby goes to the role of the state. So when we go to the role of the state in the purview of the conflict theory, we refer to the state policies one after the other. The first policy that comes up is the state formation. Here the state formation means redesigning of the policy framework where to attract or to address the marginalized at the cost of the capitalist. And that is the redistribution of wealth or addressing equity that is being guaranteed. The forces of modernization are broadened, basically the modernization in terms of technology, in terms of dominance, and deepen divisions by concentrating political and economic power at the center at the expense of the periphery. So that means with the effect of technology, with the effect of globalization, it is seen that economic power is concentrating in the hands of few, but the state has an important role to look into and to mitigate this by making the growth to be more inclusive. Secondly, state has become a means of security and access to resources. So basically it will be considered to be more instrumental for reducing any form of suppression or exploitation. So in most of the cases it is seen the state is owning the public resources, but in reality the public resources have a tendency to get privatized, where the state should not be encouraging or state should act as a communicative channel to address both the corners. Communal loyalty expressed through symbols of nationalism or ethnic regional identity rather than class provide the capacity to mobilize political action on a large scale. Here also it is important to look into the religion aspect, into the ethnicity of a nation, whereby the communal loyalty can be expressed and thereby the state can play an important role in creating the awareness programs, the campaigns that can be done so as to mobilize the political action. This also calls for a collective action which can come up with a resolution to reduce the arena or the intensity of conflict. Moreover, it is said under the role of state that the ethnic sentiments are often interpreted by the state as security threats, because in most of the cases it is seen because of the borders, cross-border litigations or immigration laws, mainly the armed forces intervene and thereby the suppression takes place by the center. So these ethnic sentiments in terms of the culture, in terms of the mix of the cultures, or in terms of the mix of the taste preference, or any kind of mix of ethnicity makes the state to intervene through armaments, but that is not desirable. So state strengthens its repressive capabilities, its ability to establish communication and bargaining networks declines. So state must be cautious. These are the words of the caution where the state must be clear of that whenever state exercises more of power or whenever the power execution takes place through different kind of capabilities, either through communication or any kind of issues, then the communication or bargaining power comes to an end. any form of negotiation becomes less desirable for the state whenever the state wants to exercise its repressive power. So that is how defective state in this regard. So any existence of a defective state makes it very clear that conflicts will always arise, and there will be no effort to reduce the conflict in the long run, and in absence of political structures and strong civil institutions, nothing can be mitigated. So the concept of the defective state arises when the state, using its policies, using its power, can actually go for some kind of repressive capabilities, can go for any kind of exploitative practices which makes the conflict to take an upper hand. So that is how the definition of a defective state comes in. So in this particular module, the most important dimensions that are being explored is the dimensions of the conflict, which is basically a political war, which can be a relationship in terms of incompatibility in the goals, and which can be a power struggle between the have and the have-nots. So this conflict is deep rooted within the war, or within the political issues, or within the economic issues. So when the causes of the conflict are highlighted, this calls for the war conflict, this calls for the negotiations which are not done, and in most of the cases the armaments come in. Thereby it calls for a kind of a principle which can be a peacemaking principle. So by the peacemaking principle, as it is said, that it can be the balancing of powers can be done between the different heads, or it can be done in case of various kind of litigations being made, or a dialogue is necessary. Or in either of the cases, if it's a failure, then creating a distance or a temporary withdrawal can be one of the resolutions that can come up. So in all these cases, the state plays an important role. But it is unfortunate in most of the cases, state exercises a discretionary power to basically create the conflict. And this is basically done by the capabilities that the state can exercise, either in terms of communication, either in terms of the power struggle or any border issues. And thereby the state can suppress the capability approach, which can be hidden within the working classes. So the role of capitalists also play an instrumental role in order to act as a catalyst to make the conflict to come up. So state must come up with a security base, state must redesign the policies so the policies become more inclusive, which can rest on the opportunity and the capability approach, and the state can also exercise a discretionary power to look after the marginalized. So a compensatory package is warranted to look after the deprived masses in terms of transfer or in terms of any kind of cash or kind subsidies, so that the deprived classes can be addressed, and thereby the capitalist classes can also given the weightage. So a kind of balancing power is needed, and thereby the role of state can be pronounced within the area of conflict.